Today's going to be a little bit different. I'm welcoming to you all a friend of this congregation, but also a good friend of mine, Wyatt Schroeder. Wyatt is... Oh, actually, I was told myself that since one of our themes is nakedness, it wouldn't be fair for me to be wearing a robe. So, Wyatt came to be known to us because he was the executive director of Catch, which is a mission partner of ours. That's how I first met Wyatt. Wyatt went on to work for the city in community partnerships and now as a consultant with Agnew Beck. And Wyatt is moving home to Philadelphia because he doesn't like me. No, it has nothing to do with me. And he said while we were out, I'd love to get to talk to the congregation. It may not be the last time, but at least one last time before moving home. And I said, well, let's preach together. So today's sermon is going to be a little bit of a conversational dialogue on themes of exile and home. Before I hand this over to Wyatt, I want to say a word about the scripture we read, because Wyatt said, oh, do your thing, pick a scripture. And I went to Genesis, because Genesis, for all that we say, and in the beginning, the mythic section of Genesis, the first 11 chapters, are actually exilic texts. They are part of what is the most productive God talk era of Israel's life, which was while they were in exile. And it makes sense that it is while they are in exile, bereft of God and home, and cut off from that which made meaning for them, the temple that held meaning for them, they told old stories about God's ability to look out over the tohu vabohu, the formlessness and void of pre-existence, and create order, just as they needed God to help them find order in exile. So we hear about Eve and Adam coming to realize their nakedness, fearing their nakedness, but also moving out into the exile east of Eden. So Wyatt, welcome.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Well, I feel like this conversation we're having today for Andrew and I is 7 years old. It's a 7-year-long conversation we've been having as colleagues and as friends. For me, at least, it starts with the physical separation, which obviously parallels to maybe some moves and physical separation you have all felt. Obviously, in the biblical story, there's a physicality, a thingness of eating a fruit and having that have a certain consequence than obviously in the Babylonian exile. But for me, I don't know, has anyone been to the Black Hills? Have you driven through it or gotten a stop? There's a certain mystery that obviously has been felt in the Black Hills for a long time. And I felt that mystery in 2014. See, it only took me from taking my entire life that I'd spent in Philadelphia around family and friends, and it only took a drive with a U-Haul hitched in the back all the way just to the Black Hills before I had that deep feeling that I wasn't in love with the person I was traveling across the country with, and I didn't know why I was doing it. I only made it that far.
And you were alone in the car.
I was not alone in the car.
Oh, you were not alone?
I was not alone in the car. This was internal.
Okay.
This was an internal realization where I felt like, for the first time, I felt this feeling of exile. Mm-hmm. But I have this deep stubbornness of I moved to Boise, landed here, and even though I immediately felt apart from the community, as we can when we move, I didn't want the Boise to beat me. It was a strange phrase I kept saying to myself. I don't want Boise to beat me. And right as I was contemplating even moving back, only a month or so in, I was fortunate enough to get what I thought was my dream job, and how I met a number of you. Became, thanks to Andrew, executive director of Catch. I was 27 years old. No one had any right to give me a leadership role, but Andrew has a certain understanding of faith. And so suddenly I have this title, this master narrative that I had been building towards, I thought was that we were supposed to grab a claim. Yes, it can be towards social justice aims, it can be for the benefit of others, but I still wanted a title. I still wanted a certain identity with capital letters. And I got that. And then fast forward, I catch us this warehouse in his current property. And it's where maybe a number of folks from First Press have donated before, beds and couches. And there was some night that I'm sitting there, and staff has gone home, and I'm just breaking down. Because it's our job at Catch to give home to others. And I just want so badly God to answer the question, how come I can't feel at home then? It had been now a year or so that I'd been living in Boise, but I'd still been apart from it in some way. I'd still not sure this feeling I had and not wanting to be naked in my own life and vulnerable with myself. I just thought that if you achieved a certain thing, you were supposed to feel good. It's a checkbox, right? You know, it's get 9 sandwiches, get the 10th free. Like I was on my 10th free. And yet I felt apart. And so talking through Andrew in his office back there around that time, Andrew is listening to me. At least I think he's listening, because he stands up in the middle of my talking, turns his back to me, is now at the bookshelf, and I'm like, Andrew, I'm trying to pour out my soul here. And he grabs a book off the shelf, hands it to me, and says, you're feeling your own Babylonian exile. So that was some 6 years ago, and I've been using that narrative ever since, and I'm curious your reaction to it. But like I've been trying to redefine my own master narrative, which was linear, which was progress always goes up, which is we get a title and then a better title, and eventually we earn enough money to feel happy. And I was feeling the opposite of all that. As a physical exile away from my home of Philadelphia, a personal exile of feeling apart and separated from my Eden, and this not being sure how to interface with the community, even though I was doing the community's work.
I think that's it's fascinating. This week I was in a conversation with a church member. I was talking about conversations around the role of the Presbyterian Church in endorsing and giving a faith language to the American colonial time period. And it's this whole idea of the Protestant work ethic, right?
Yep.
And the church member said, well, I've always thought Presbyterian churches that I've been in did a lot of good talk about community. And I said, yeah, but we can use the word community so that it can be the reality in place of what is actually maybe not real community.
Yep.
And so you've talked before with me this sense of like you suddenly realized in exile that you were living a fake identity.
Yes.
Right? Like you wanted a title. I'm executive director.
Yep.
Or the political drive of I am now head of community partnerships at the city of Boise. And then ultimately when we get that, we recognize that somehow that doesn't stand in the place of really of home and of true, authentic self.
Yep.
And I think that happens to worshiping communities too. When we're going, I mean, this is the whole lead up to the exilic time period when the prophets are looking out at Israel and saying, corporately, you have a title that's not fulfilling you, or that you're not fulfilling. And so the exile, which we often want to talk about as a thing that happened to us, is actually a thing that we're pushed into.
Yes.
Just as Jesus is pushed into the desert by the Spirit, just as in the Exodus, the slaves are pushed out into the wilderness to wander for 40 years, there's this need to push out. And I think right now, in some of what's happening in our society, with COVID as a catalyst, but not the cause, is that we're all feeling this need to like move into exile from what we thought was giving us meaning that either we're cut off from because there's not 200 people in here anymore, or what we're cut off from because we suddenly question whether our jobs are as fulfilling as they once were, and then we go, what then fills that cutoffness?
Yeah, it was last March, a big month for all of us. For me, at the beginning of March, I made the brilliant decision of leaving my role in the mayor's office at the city of Boise. It just didn't feel right anymore. It just felt too much tension, and it felt like we were living into our false selves as a community in certain ways. Really smart move, really recommend it. Definitely leave your job 2 weeks before a pandemic. But what it did for me, which now I feel really grateful for, is I was able to personally medicate and indulge my false self through the number of emails I got a day, number of meetings I held. I was proud to say, like, I held like at 5 o'clock the work wasn't done. Let's just now go at 10 barrel to keep the conversation going. And I did that for some 6 years here, and then suddenly I'm not in a role with a title. No one's sure when to call me, and you learn very quickly who your real friends are, right? Who was reaching out because you were seen as a young riser, and who was reaching out because I am Wyatt, which means I only got a few emails a day. That really hurt. And I then had to stare into the desert of my own self and say, well, what is left? Thomas Merton, the Catholic monk, talks about the illusory false self, and that we all have in ourselves a true self. And he talks about how that to get to that true self, by leaning in and walking alongside the divine, it feels a lot like nothingness. And I've read that quote for years. I've even used it in other sermons or other things I've been in. I never knew what it meant until I heard nothing, until the world stopped chattering. It was obviously existential in a certain way, but just in my own personal life, it was very, very quiet. And so I started taking walks along, just the street and the bench, and I started just stop filling my head with a new podcast every single moment, or a new, band that I wanted to listen to. And then I just felt like each day there was a certain nothingness I was living into, a no-thingness. I wasn't trying to go after this thing in my own life that could keep my false self going, or even how I defined God, of asking for a Damascus moment, asking for a thing to come my way, or a person to come my way to save me. You just very quickly realize that within that nothingness is your journey. It's yourself calling out.
So a couple of things you just said there that I think are really, really important. First of all, and I'm looking at Don over there because he helped me frame this a few years ago. I love to talk about our desire to have a vending machine God, right? So your Thomas Merton quote, "God is no thing," and that comes about in a deep spiritual journey, whether it's Thomas Merton or St. John of the Cross or many of
Thomas
these
Aquinas.
contemplative theologians, because they realize how much of our life we're trying to make God at our beck and call. So I like to think about how often is our prayer pushing the A4 button so a Snickers will come out, and then, or it's a prayer because we're really mad because we pressed A4 and a bag of Lay's potato chips came out, and that's just not going to do for the craving we've got right now, and we want to say, God, I hit A4, come on, that's not what I asked for. And there's this moment, there's a potential moment I think we all experience, and I'm going to call it a Holy Week moment, because I do normally wear a robe. And so, I just got to make everything about Scripture. I like to give Wyatt a hard time because he's a Unitarian Universalist, but he's really at heart a Presbyterian who doesn't know it. But there's this, in Holy Week, there's this need, I think, that we have to kill God. And I don't get offended. Listen to what I'm trying to say. We need to kill the vending machine God. We need to nail that God to the cross and kill it so that we can be awake to the real God lying on the backside of that cross, right? The God of the empty tomb, the God of no thing, right? And be open to that. But another word you said there is we have to be willing to lean into these deeply discomforting places.
Yes.
And most of our status quo, most of our worship life, most of our cultural norms are built up like fig tree leaf clothing to make sure we never become naked. We're really skilled at not becoming vulnerable in those moments.
Yes. Which is so tough to enter into space with others. Who is it? Rachel Raymond's got the quote of fixing and helping are the work of the ego. Service is the work of the soul. And I know in my life, and this congregation it's why I've identified with you, I think gets this more than most that I ever have worked with, which is, do you enter into space saying, I'm going to interact with you this way?
Right.
Congratulations. or are we entering into the service space of saying, I'm going to be vulnerable enough to truly listen to what you need, what you need in this moment. And I even felt that, to be honest, with my own congregation, the Boise Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. I've been on my own journey with my congregation. I'm sure some of you have felt this with First Pres and with others. But whenever I didn't know how to be vulnerable, if I'm being honest. I didn't know how to be naked and in the space of faith. I didn't know how. It was not from the Methodist tradition that I grew up in. It was not taught. We were too waspy to truly talk about feelings. It was not welcome. Our God was not a feelings God. But then eventually I realized I'd been going to my congregation for, at that point, 5 or so years. And each time I entered in that space and wanted to be vulnerable, it was still, Wyatt, you're not working hard enough to end homelessness. It was like, we care about social justice so much that I felt shamed by my own congregation that I wasn't doing it right or enough or loud enough or big enough. And so I just stopped going.
Right.
And our pastor, Sarah, is one of my best friends, and we're sitting down, and she asked me what I need to come back. And I then asked, can I have the pulpit to talk? And just talk, because that's how I process, as odd as it sounds in a group like this. And what I was able to say is that I had been feeling this want, this yearning, this exile from my own Christian narrative. That I had been in a Unitarian space for a long time, but I love the idea of the Talmud in the Judaic tradition that we can keep retelling the same stories over and over again with new interpretations. I wanted that. I wanted that space. Where is that space for me? If we are so black and white on what is or is not social justice...
Just so you know, it's at 950 West State Street.
And so I got to say that to our congregation, that I hadn't felt welcomed by them, that I hadn't been allowed to walk my own faith journey, that so much of this was technocratic, so much of this was intellectual, and I wanted to be vulnerable, and I didn't know how, and I wanted their help. And since then, I just learned that by asking that of each other, you can get it. That I wasn't asking that of others. I was waiting for them to recognize I was broken, to recognize I needed to be vulnerable, and to cure that for me.
Right.
And so, I just say that we're all in this exile moment, and that it's okay to ask. It's okay to ask others for help to overcome that exile, or more to your point, to reclaim that exile, not to cure it.
Right. So I'm wondering so you're on the precipice, if we will, of going home, right? And I'm just so cognizant of how quickly the power structures that we're trying to dismantle or leave behind, think Pharaoh, think the temple cult of Solomon, how quickly they try to gather us back in and say, don't you love normal, right? Don't you love normal?
Love convenience.
This is the temptation of the slaves in the wilderness to say, we had it great back in Egypt, right? Let's go back, right? Because this manna, this what is it, is not very fulfilling, right? So we have this deep temptation to go back.
Yeah.
How, when we re-enter home, how do you hold on to your exile? Like, what do you imagine you'll do that it's not necessarily returning, but it's entering a new home, a new old home?
Yeah, I think that's powerful. I've been told by a few that they're surprised I didn't move back sooner. And in my own journey, my own narrative, what I've kind of realized is that I was not done being remade. There's Andrew and I were talking about this. There's this thought in biology, and please know I'm a political science major, so any scientist in the room, tell me how I'm wrong in a couple of minutes. But that at the atomic level, our cells are regenerating. That the food we eat, the air we breathe, how we're just encouraging that kind of cellular recreation, and that over 7 to 10 years, we're for the most part almost resurrected at a cellular level. I just think that's such a powerful metaphor. Obviously, 7 is such a biblical number. And so it just got me thinking about how we can practice resurrection. And that I wasn't done being resurrected yet. And so at some level I feel like I'm going home, but I now feel more completely that I am home.
Right.
My physical location can change, and I didn't get this before because I wanted to go back. I wanted to be nostalgic. I wanted to return. I wanted the Jerusalem that had been burned to still be the Jerusalem that wasn't burned.
Right.
But that's gone. Those days are done. And so I feel like I'm now walking not back, but forward, and still want to claim Boise as home, want to claim multiple faith communities, and just be more comfortable of who Wyatt's identity doesn't have to be so caught up in that this is God's church as much as this is God's church. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like that's the lesson I want to live into a little bit more, that you can take the desert with you, and that you shouldn't end your exile should transform.
Well, on some level, okay, we're a totally different place than we were at the last service, but
we knew this would happen. This was inevitable.
There's this need a lot of times for external validation, and what you're naming, I think, right now is the exile taught you to live without that external validation.
Yep.
Whether it's the list of emails or whether it's the overly full calendar. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong. We compete to see who's busiest, right? Like it's become the American game, right?
Yep.
Because you are more worthwhile if you are busier than me.
Correct.
Instead of it being really that you're just really worse at keeping a livable schedule, which is the reality of that.
So what's the flip side for the faith tradition right now? As we like, I saw someone recently had the term post-COVID, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I wrote that 6 months ago." And I don't know if there is if there is such a thing as post-COVID. So I'm kind of curious, what's the faith equivalent of transforming our own exile right now? As we haven't been able to quote unquote practice service in the world, maybe in the ways that we had envisioned.
I just heard that question. I just looked at the clock and I was like, no way.
Yeah.
But I think the challenge for all of us, I think is that we're all cut off from meaning right now. I think a lot of us are feeling that, and I think part of it is a willingness to lean into that, to find out what it is that used to define us, and whether we really maybe just don't need that anymore. So, I mean, for preachers, it's full pews, and we're just never going to have that again. I mean, we're just never going to have that again. And is it okay for us to recognize? I have this ability to go and realize that my work is meaningless, right? I think a lot. I wrote a newsletter article, so go read that one, about most people are disconnected from the impact of their jobs right now, and so they're feeling very meaningless in their work. And I have the ability to think and look out here and go, my job is lost meaning. And then I think about work we've done together and our holy friendship. And I go, is it possible to count one as greater than many? And that is still of meaning. And I had this moment. Bill Herrenberg, member of our church, died 2 weeks ago. And I was gifted to happen to be in his home the day he died. Not at the time, but that same day. And got what was probably one of the last smiles out of him. And I was like, okay, that can carry me through. Mm-hmm. So I think that part of it is like recognizing that we've got to stop imagining things we know will never be true will ever be true again, and then not looking for that validation.
Yep.
And then remembering it every single day.
Yep.
So I love that Deuteronomy 6 phrase, bind these things on your heart. And so every day I'm thinking to myself, my calendar does not define my worth. Mm-hmm. The people in the pews do not define my worth. A single provocative relationship made it all worthwhile. Mm-hmm. And I think that, and we just have to be tempted, or keep ourselves from being tempted to go back. Last thought.
I think for my last thought, I would just give a prayer of thanksgiving. And whenever I originally asked Andrew, I wasn't picturing any kind of personal sermon as much as I just want a couple minutes to say thank you. For me, being so far from my home congregations and everything, it's meant a lot to realize I can practice in multiple spaces. And so, though I haven't been a member of First Presbyterian through Andrew and through getting to know a lot of you, it's just been so meaningful to see. So thank you for being the congregation that you are. As someone who struggles with and struggles to serve its community around homelessness, it's just so great to know there are people that create space, to have conversations, to volunteer, to get involved, to give donations and give your alms. Like, that meant so much to me. So thank you, First Presbyterian. Please keep that spirit alive. And huge thank you to your pastor. I just want to say this in front of you all. Andrew is an amazing minister, and it's so needed right now. This congregation, and Andrew on behalf of it, is a thought leader around how to end homelessness. No credit. You want to talk about no external validation? That word has not fully gotten out, the role that First Presbyterian plays and the role that Andrew specifically plays. And I just want to tell you it's real, and people feel it. Being in the right conversations, showing up, pushing us to be better is so needed. And that's been the role that Andrew has played in my personal life, and the role of keeping Catch, one of the best nonprofits in the state, and the role for people who are experiencing homelessness today. So a huge thank you to you, Andrew, and to your ministry here at First Pres. It means a lot.